Jerusalem, 587 BC. For almost a year, the Babylonian army has camped outside the walls, and inside the city, food is running out. In the royal quarter, on the steep ridge south of where the temple stands, a prophet named Jeremiah has spent these last desperate months telling anyone who will listen that the city cannot win, that surrender is the only way to survive. The king's officials have heard enough. 4 of them, Shephatiah, Gedaliah, Jehukal, and Pashur, confront him in the court of the guard, seize him by the arms, and lower him on ropes into a cistern near the palace, deep and bell-shaped and bone-dry of water. What waits at the bottom is mud, cold and thick, and Jeremiah sinks into it up to his armpits as the ropes are pulled back up above him. Far overhead, the cistern's mouth shows only a small circle of daylight. He is left there, in the dark, to die. 26 centuries later, on this same narrow ridge, archaeologists sifting through ancient debris will lift out 2 small lumps of hardened clay, each barely the size of a fingernail. Pressed into each one, in ancient Hebrew script, are the names of 2 of those very officials. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, we descend into the city of David, the narrow ridge where Jerusalem began, to follow the city's story from its first king to its last, and the century and a half of excavation that has uncovered, argued over, and slowly pieced its physical remains back together. South of today's Temple Mount, the ridge narrows to little more than a spur of bedrock, roughly the size of a few city blocks, hemmed in by 2 steep ravines, the Kidron to the east and the Tyropaeon to the west. Don't be fooled by how the Tyropaeon looks today. Centuries of accumulated rubble have filled it in until it barely registers as a dip in the street. In David's time, it was a true ravine, every bit as dramatic as the Kidron. And together the 2 cut this ridge off from its surroundings on almost every side. It does not look like the beginning of a great city, but ancient settlements were built where water was, not where land was flattest, and halfway down the eastern slope, the Gihon Spring pushes fresh water out of the rock in irregular surges. Its Hebrew name simply means gushing. For centuries, it was the only reliable water source for miles. By the time this story begins, around 1000 BC, the ridge was already home to a fortified Canaanite city the Hebrew text calls Jebus, its people, the Jebusites. Their walls climbed the steep slope above the spring in stepped stone terracing, built to make the city look and feel unconquerable. The entire fortified city covered perhaps 10 or 11 acres, closer to a fortified village than anything resembling the Jerusalem of later centuries. Its significance was never about size, but position, a defensible ridge sitting almost exactly on the border between the northern and southern tribal territories of Israel and Judah. This was the world a young king from Bethlehem was about to test. Around 1000 BC, David, ruling at this point over a loose confederation of tribes from his base in Hebron, set his sights on Jebus. According to the account in 2 Samuel, the city's defenders were so confident in their walls that they mocked David, boasting that even the blind and the lame could keep him out. David's response was to offer command of his army to whoever could strike the city first, and his nephew Joab took the challenge. The text gives one tantalizing clue about how he did it. He went up through what the Hebrew calls the tzinor, usually translated as a water shaft or gutter. What that word actually describes is a question we will come back to. Whatever the precise route, the city fell, and David made it his own. He renamed it the City of David, reinforced a structure the text calls the Millo, likely a terraced fill supporting the slope, and made it his capital. For the first time, Israel and Judah had a single capital belonging to neither group exclusively. A calculated choice by a king trying to hold a fractured people together. His son Solomon inherited a city already straining at its edges. The ridge itself was simply too narrow and too steep to hold a growing royal administration, so Solomon expanded northward, onto the open hilltop that would become the platform for the temple, a 7-year project the text describes down to the imported cedar and the bronze pillars at its entrance. The City of David Ridge remained the administrative heart of the kingdom even as the religious center shifted north beside it, and the massive stone terracing still visible on its eastern slope, climbing in tiers toward the summit, likely belongs to a building program from somewhere in this general era, even if its exact date and the building it once supported remain genuinely contested, as we will see shortly. For nearly 3 centuries afterward, the City of David functioned as it was built to function, the seat of Judah's kings, layered year upon year with the ordinary debris of administration, pottery, storerooms, fortification walls repaired and rebuilt across generations. The ridge's most serious vulnerability was the same one its first conquerors had exploited. The Gihon Spring sat outside the city walls, exposed on the open hillside. Late in the 8th century BC, with Assyria pressing into Judah and King Sennacherib's army on the march, King Hezekiah moved to close that gap for good. According to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, he ordered a tunnel cut through solid bedrock to redirect the spring's water into a pool safely inside the city walls, a project that meant burying the spring's exposed outlet and digging blind through rock toward a meeting point neither team could see in advance. The tunnel survives, and you can still wade through it today. Near its southern end, ancient quarrymen carved an inscription into the wall describing the moment the 2 digging teams heard each other's pickaxes through the rock and broke through to meet in the middle. The original stone did not stay there long, in archaeological terms. A decade after its discovery in 1880, it was cut out of the wall and broken into pieces by an antiquities dealer. Ottoman authorities eventually recovered the fragments and sent them to Istanbul, where the inscription remains today. What visitors see at the spot now is a faithful replica. The real stone is a long way from the tunnel it was carved in. The city survived Sennacherib's siege in 701 BC. The biblical text describes that survival as a dramatic act of divine deliverance. The Assyrian king's own royal records describe the same event from the opposite side of the wall, boasting that he shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage, and stopping short of any claim that he had actually taken the city. 2 ancient accounts, written for very different purposes, agree on the one fact that mattered most. Jerusalem still stood when the siege ended. It would not always stand. A little over a century later, the kingdom of Judah had become a vassal state squeezed between Egypt and the rising power of Babylon, and its kings, including the final one, Zedekiah, kept gambling on rebellion. The Second Babylonian siege dragged on for roughly a year and a half, and by its final months, the text describes conditions inside the walls turning desperate, food reserves exhausted, the city's defenders worn thin. This brings us back to the scene that opened this episode. With the Babylonian army outside the walls for the second and final time, Zedekiah's officials saw Jeremiah's calls for surrender as treason and acted accordingly, lowering him into the cistern to die. He did not. An official named Ebed-Melech, a Cushite man serving in the royal household, convinced the king to let him be pulled back out before he starved, and the prophet survived to see what came next. What came next was the end. In 586 BC, the walls finally broke. Babylonian troops poured into the royal quarter, set fire to the palace and the temple, and pulled down the stone terracing of the officials' houses one structure at a time. The whole ridge burned hot enough to scorch mud brick walls nearly to glass, and what didn't burn was buried under collapsing stone. Much of the population was marched into exile, and the royal quarter on the city of David Ridge, the same ground David had taken from the Jebusites 4 centuries earlier, was reduced to ash and rubble within weeks, sealing almost perfectly a layer of debris that archaeologists would eventually find still carrying the fingerprints of the people who lived through that final year. The city of David has been excavated in fits and starts for more than 150 years, and almost every major feature on this ridge has been fought over by more than one generation of archaeologists. Start with the water. British engineer Charles Warren surveyed the site's water systems in 1867 and gave his name to the vertical shaft connected to the Gihon Spring, long assumed to be the very sinner Joab climbed to take the city. A century later, Kathleen Kenyon's excavations in the 1960s established much of the site's basic stratigraphy, the layered sequence of soil and debris archaeologists use to date what they find, and her work, building on earlier digging by R.A.S. McAllister and J.G. Duncan in the 1920s, showed that Jerusalem in David's own lifetime was considerably more modest than later tradition assumed. More recent excavation by archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukran indicates that Warren's shaft was not actually exposed or usable until roughly 800 BC, several centuries after David's traditional dates, which has led most specialists to set aside the old Joab's shaft theory. Though a few scholars still argue the shaft could have functioned earlier than that. Reich and Shukran's work did confirm something else with more confidence. Massive fortification towers around the spring, dating to the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 1800 to 1700 BC, proof that this site was a defended stronghold many centuries before David ever arrived. The terraced stepped stone structure, first exposed by McAllister and Duncan in the 1920s, and fully revealed by Yigal Shiloh in the 1980s, and the walls above it that archaeologist Eilat Mazar labeled the large stone structure, sit at the center of the era's most contested debate. Mazar, excavating from 2005 onward, proposed that the large stone structure was a single monumental building from around 1000 BC, identified as the Palace of King David. A team of Tel Aviv University archaeologists, Israel Finkelstein, Zeev Herzog, Lily Singer-Avitz, and David Usishkin, challenged that dating sharply, arguing the visible remains could date centuries later. Other scholars, including Amihai Mazar, have proposed a different middle position, that the walls are genuinely Iron Age, but belong to a Jebusite stronghold, quite possibly the very fortress of Zion that 2 Samuel says David captured and made his own base. On that reading, the building's importance to David's story is not that he built it, but that he took it. The debate remains unresolved, and any claim that this building has been definitively identified as David's palace should be treated as one interpretation among several credible ones, not a settled fact. The Bullae, clay seal impressions, anchor parts of this story unusually well, though not all of them sit in equally secure ground. In 1982, Yigal Shiloh's excavation uncovered a hoard of more than 50 clay seal impressions in a single burned room, sealed in place by the very fire that destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. Among them, one reading, "Belonging to Gemariah, son of Shaphan, a scribe named in the book of Jeremiah." It is about as secure a context as archaeology gets. A sealed room, a single fire, a single moment frozen in the ground. Decades later, Eilat Mazar's excavations nearby recovered two more bullae naming the same two officials described lowering Jeremiah into the cistern, Jehukal, son of Shelemiah, found within the walls of the large stone structure in 2005, and Gedaliah, son of Pashur, recovered in 2007 from debris cleared near a collapsing tower farther down the slope, through wet sifting, washing excavated soil through fine screens to catch what a shovel would miss. The method recovers small objects brilliantly, but ties them to their original context less precisely than a sealed room like Shiloh's. Both finds are accepted as genuine First Temple period artifacts. The difference matters mainly for how confidently each can be pinned to one exact moment in time. These finds confirm that men by these names, holding these titles, were active in Jerusalem in this period, not that every detail of the narrative around them is independently verified. Excavation continues today on the opposite side of the ridge, at the Givati parking lot, where archaeologists Yuval Gadot and Yiftah Shalev uncovered a large public building from the kingdom's final years, destroyed in the same fire that ended it. Inside it, in 2019, their team recovered a bulla reading, "Belonging to Nathan Melech, servant of the king," a name and title that closely matches an official serving under King Josiah in 2 Kings. As with the rest of this site's history, new announcements here tend to be followed quickly by careful scholarly scrutiny before anyone treats them as settled. There is something quietly striking about the fact that the objects this ridge keeps giving up are rarely dramatic. Not gold, not weapons, small lumps of clay, pressed once by an official's ring to seal a document that rotted away centuries ago. And yet 2 of those lumps carry the names of men who, according to the text, tried to silence a prophet by leaving him to die in the mud beneath their own palace. The clay survived. Their attempt to bury Jeremiah's words did not. Whether that is irony, justice, or simply the way time treats power and memory differently, is something the ridge itself does not answer. It just keeps handing back fragments, a sealed room here, a seal impression there, and leaving the rest of the story to whoever is paying attention. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.